The sound that woke me up wasn't an alarm. It was my own car door slamming shut, followed by silence. I pressed the remote to open the gate. Nothing happened. No beep, no motor, just a tall iron gate locked shut at the only entrance to our neighborhood. A gate that had never been locked in the 5 years I'd lived there. I stepped out and walked closer. That's when I saw it. A thick steel padlock had been chained onto the emergency release. Behind me, cars started lining up. A man in a sharp suit checked his watch and said he had a court session starting in 10 minutes. Another said their ambulance was on the way and you need to start dialysis in 10 minutes. Then Margaret from the HOA walked up with her clipboard and smiled. "Good morning," she said. "The board voted to restrict access." I pointed at the lock. "That's for emergencies," she shrugged. "Emergencies will be handled when we approve them." That was when I realized this wasn't about rules or safety, because the sirens I could hear in the distance weren't coming to our neighborhood. They were trying to get inside it, and the gate wasn't going to let them through. The woman standing in front of the gate was Margaret Hale. She was the vice president of the HOA board, not the top name on paper, but everyone in the neighborhood knew she was the one who actually made decisions. Margaret didn't shout, she didn't rush. She positioned herself directly between us and the control box clipboard tucked under her arm, blazer, crisp posture, perfect. The kind of calm that only comes from believing you can't be challenged. "This is an HOA action," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. The board approved restricted access. Someone asked when the vote happened. She ignored the question. I pointed at the steel padlock on the emergency release. "That's not supposed to be locked." Margaret glanced at it for half a second, then looked back at me. "Emergency access will be granted when appropriate." "By who?" I asked. Her lips curved into a thin smile. "By us?" That was when it became clear this wasn't about safety or rules, or even the gate. Margaret Hale wasn't guarding the entrance. She was testing how much control she could take and how many people would let her. The first warning didn't come by email or letter. It showed up that afternoon, zip-tied to my mailbox like a tag on seized property. A bright orange citation. "Unauthorized gate interaction, $450 fine." I stared at it for a full 10 seconds, waiting for it to make sense. I hadn't touched the gate. I hadn't climbed it. I hadn't blocked traffic or argued with anyone. I had stood on my own street and asked a question. I walked straight to the entrance. Margaret Hale was already there, positioned beside the control box, like it belonged to her. Clipboard tucked under her arm, blazer, spotless expression, calm. She looked exactly like someone who expected to be confronted and wasn't worried about it. "I didn't interact with the gate," I said, holding the citation up. "I didn't touch anything." She glanced at the paper and nodded once. "You approached restricted infrastructure. I live here." She checked a box on her clipboard. "Residency doesn't override compliance." By early evening, I realized I wasn't the only one. Orange tags started appearing up and down the street. One neighbor fined for tailgating when the gate opened for a delivery truck. Another cited for loitering near access equipment after waiting too close to the keypad. A woman across from me got hit with a fine for questioning board authority because she asked why her caregiver wasn't allowed inside. Every citation looked the same language, same formatting, same signature, Margaret's. There were no explanations and no appeal instructions, just a line at the bottom that felt less like policy and more like a threat. Continued violations may result in restricted access privileges. As the sun went down, the gate stayed closed longer than usual. Cars stacked up at the entrance. Engines idled. People glanced at the control box, then away. No one honked. That was when it became clear this wasn't about enforcing rules. It was about conditioning behavior. Teaching people that asking questions had a cost, and that silence was cheaper. And watching my neighbors wait instead of push, I understood exactly what Margaret was measuring. Not compliance, fear. By the next morning, the system made itself official. An email hit every inbox just after 6 a.m., stamped with the HOA logo and written in the same flat, confident tone Margaret always used when she wanted something to sound non-negotiable. Updated access procedures effective immediately. No greeting, no explanation, just rules. Gate access would now be monitored. Tailgating was prohibited. Pedestrian proximity to the control box was restricted. All visitors, caregivers, and service providers had to be pre-approved and entered into an access log. Violations would result in fines, suspension of gate privileges, or further review by the board. I read it twice, then a third time, looking for the part where it mentioned emergencies. It wasn't there. That afternoon, the board made their first appearance as a group. 3 of them stood near the gate with Margaret arms crossed, nodding along as she explained the new normal to anyone who asked. None of them looked comfortable, but none of them contradicted her either. A neighbor tried to wave in a home health aid. Margaret stepped forward and stopped the car with one raised hand. "Name's not on the list," she said. The aide explained who she was there for. Margaret shook her head. "Reschedule. Compliance comes first." The neighbor's face went red. "This is medical care." Margaret didn't argue. She just wrote something down. By evening, people stopped approaching the gate unless they had to. Conversations moved off the street and into driveways. Phones stayed out, screens glowing, documenting everything. Screenshots, times, names. The conflict had shifted. This wasn't one woman abusing power anymore. This was the board backing her, the rules being rewritten in real time, and the gate turning into a checkpoint. And standing there watching approved cars pass while others were turned away, I realized something that made my stomach drop. Margaret wasn't just enforcing policy. She was building a paper trail, one that assumed she'd never have to answer to anyone above her. The real damage didn't announce itself with sirens or shouting. It arrived quietly, buried in paperwork. 3 days after the new access rules went out, I got another email, this one shorter, colder. It said my gate privileges were under review due to a pattern of non-compliance. No examples, no dates, just a warning that continued issues could result in suspension. That same morning, an elderly couple, 2 houses down, couldn't get their medical equipment delivered. The driver waited at the gate for 20 minutes before turning around. Margaret logged it as a failed access attempt and issued a citation to the homeowners for improper visitor authorization. That's when people stopped assuming this was temporary. A neighbor who worked in construction pulled me aside and showed me something he'd noticed while fixing a sprinkler line near the gate motor. The emergency override wiring didn't look right. The casing had been opened, new connections spliced in. Clean work. Intentional. We started asking questions, quiet ones. Someone requested maintenance records. Someone else pulled HOA financials. Another neighbor forwarded an email Margaret had sent late one night outlining updated emergency procedures. One sentence sat there like a loaded weapon. Emergency access will be granted only after HOA verification. Not when possible, not unless unsafe. Only after approval. Reading that, my annoyance turned into something colder. Because that wasn't arrogance or confusion. That was a written policy saying help could be delayed by design. By the end of the week, fines were stacking up mid-4 figures for some households. People with caregivers were being warned about habitual violations. Delivery services started refusing jobs in our neighborhood altogether. And through it all, Margaret grew more confident. She stood at the gate during peak hours, recording plates, making notes, correcting people publicly. When someone asked if this was legal, she smiled and said, "Everything here has been reviewed." But nothing had been. What she'd actually done, what we finally understood, was modify critical infrastructure without permits, without authorization, and without regard for safety. This wasn't about control anymore. This was about liability. And once that line was crossed, there was no backing away from it. The shift happened the moment someone outside the HOA noticed. It started with a city traffic officer pulling up near the entrance one afternoon, lights off, engine idling. He wasn't responding to a call. He was just there, looking at the way cars were stacking up, the way drivers were being waved through or turned away, like this was a private checkpoint on a public road. Margaret stepped forward immediately. "This is HOA-controlled property," she said, confident. "Access is restricted." The officer asked for documentation. She told him it was on file. He asked where. She said the board handled that. He didn't argue. He took photos, wrote notes, asked a few residents where the street connected to the city grid. Then he left. The next day, a county inspector showed up. This time Margaret tried a different approach, polite, helpful, overly cooperative. She explained the gate upgrades as safety improvements and referred to emergency protocols she couldn't produce in writing. When the inspector asked about permits for modifying emergency overrides, her answers got shorter. By midweek, calls were being returned by lawyers instead of board members. A surveyor confirmed the entrance road wasn't fully private. A clerk quietly admitted no permits had been filed for electrical modifications. A code enforcement officer asked why emergency access logs existed for a residential gate. Every question exposed another crack. Margaret responded by tightening enforcement. More citations, louder warnings, threats of towing and access suspension. It felt desperate now, like she was trying to outrun scrutiny by asserting authority faster. Then, during rush hour, the gate locked again. Cars trapped inside. Others stuck outside. Phones came out. Someone forced the pedestrian release, triggering an alarm that brought private security, who showed up not to help, but to threaten fines. That was loud enough to draw real attention. When a city officer returned and asked why a gate was obstructing public access, Margaret claimed full authority. When asked to prove it, she couldn't. He didn't argue. He documented, and in that quiet procedural way, the conflict crossed its final threshold. Because once the city starts writing things down, power stops being about confidence and starts being about facts. The breaking point didn't come weeks later. It came the very next morning. Just before sunrise, the gate was locked again. Same silence. Same dead control box, same steel padlock shackled to the emergency release like it was daring someone to test it. Cars stacked up fast, engines idled, breath-fogged windshields. No one laughed this time. A man in scrubs paced beside his car phone, pressed to his ear, repeating that he was trapped. Another driver said his mother's home nurse was already on the way and wouldn't be able to get in. Someone farther back shouted that they were late for a medical appointment across town. Margaret Hale arrived like clockwork. Clipboard, calm voice, same script. She told everyone the gate was locked due to ongoing compliance review, and that access would be granted once procedures were followed. When someone pointed at the padlocked emergency release, she said emergencies would be evaluated individually. Then a woman near the back of the line sat down hard on the curb. Not dramatically, not for attention. She just went pale and folded forward, breathing shallow eyes, unfocused. The street went quiet in a way that felt dangerous. Someone yelled for help. Someone else dialed 911 and said the words out loud this time, locked gate. Margaret turned away and made a phone call of her own, nodding as if that solved something. Sirens appeared at the far end of the road, close enough now to hear clearly. And that's when it happened. A paramedic radioed dispatch that they couldn't access the entrance. Margaret stepped closer to the gate, positioning herself between it and the crowd, and said, "Emergency access will be granted once HOA verification is complete." No one argued. Everyone filmed. Because in that moment, with emergency vehicles waiting and residents trapped, the line was crossed permanently. This wasn't an HOA dispute anymore. This was obstruction. And whatever happened next was going to happen in public, under authority, and with consequences no clipboard could control. The fire engine stopped 10 feet from the gate lights, washing the iron bars in red and white. Radios crackled. Doors opened. The smell of fuel hung in the air, now strong enough that no one was pretending anymore. The captain stepped down first. Calm, focused. One look at the padlock on the emergency release was all it took. "I need that gate opened," he said. Margaret moved instantly, placing herself between him and the control box, like she'd rehearsed it. Clipboard up, voice steady. "Access requires HOA verification," she said. "We're coordinating." The captain stared at her for a long second. "Ma'am, this is a medical emergency." She nodded as if agreeing with a weather report. "And we're handling it." Behind them, a woman shouted that someone had collapsed. Phones were up everywhere now. No yelling, just recording, documenting. "I'm giving you a lawful order," the captain said louder this time. "Open the gate. Now." Margaret shook her head. "You can't bypass protocol." That was when the captain turned away from her. "Dispatch," he said, into his radio eyes, still on the gate. "Confirm obstruction of emergency access." A pause. Then a clear reply. "Confirmed." The captain didn't look back at Margaret when he gave the next order. "Prepare to force entry." The words landed heavy. Tools came out. The crew moved with practiced speed, calm, and unstoppable. Margaret's voice rose for the first time. "You can't do this. This is HOA property." No one answered her, because in that moment authority had changed hands and the gate was about to find out. The first tool hit the metal with a sharp final ring that cut through everything else. Bolt cutters snapped shut around the padlock. One clean squeeze. The lock shattered and dropped to the pavement like it had never mattered. Someone gasped. Not in fear, relief. The captain didn't rush. He crouched, pointed at the control housing, and called it out loud so everyone could hear. "Emergency override is disabled." An inspector who had just arrived stepped closer, filming the wiring inside the open panel. "This isn't standard," he said. "This has been altered." Margaret stepped forward, shaking now. "Those were safety upgrades," she said quickly. "Board approved." "Then you'll have permits," the inspector replied without looking at her. She didn't. The captain keyed his radio again. "Dispatch emergency access intentionally disabled. Request fire marshal and city code enforcement." The response was immediate. While the crew forced the gate arm open, a police officer arrived and started asking questions, real ones. Who authorized the modifications? Who ordered the lock on the emergency release? Who decided verification came before access? Margaret tried to answer all of them at once. Policies, procedures, liability. HOA authority? It didn't matter. A resident handed the officer a printed email, Margaret's own words, stating emergency access required HOA approval. Another showed video of her denying entry earlier that morning. Another pulled up timestamp citations issued during emergencies. The officer looked at the screen, then at the broken lock on the ground. "Ma'am," he said, "you're going to step back." For the first time since this started, Margaret didn't argue. She stepped aside, and standing there watching officials read her emails, review her videos, and photograph the damage she'd caused, it became clear to everyone at once. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was documented. It was deliberate. And it was collapsing in real time. The gate finally gave way with a long metallic groan bending inward as the crew forced it open. Alarms screamed. The arm sagged useless now, and the fire engine rolled through, without slowing radios barking orders as it disappeared into the neighborhood. No one cheered. We just watched. Margaret stood frozen at the curb, clipboard clenched so hard her knuckles had gone white. She tried to speak something about liability, about charges, but her voice was swallowed by sirens and the steady movement of emergency vehicles passing freely through what had been her checkpoint minutes earlier. A fire marshal arrived, took one look at the damaged gate, and then at the exposed wiring inside the control box. He shook his head slowly. "Who authorized these modifications?" he asked. Margaret opened her mouth, closed it, then said the board. "Which members?" he pressed. She hesitated. That hesitation did more damage than any answer could have. A police officer stepped closer. "Ma'am, you're going to wait over there." "Not, please. Not if you don't mind. Over there." Margaret complied. Phones stayed raised as inspectors, photographed everything: the lock, the disabled, override, the warning signs, the control housing. Citations were written, names were taken, deadlines were stated out loud. And with each official step, Margaret's authority peeled away in layers. By the time the last emergency vehicle passed through the open entrance, the gate lay twisted and broken on the pavement, not destroyed in anger, but dismantled with purpose. Margaret stared at it like it had betrayed her. But it hadn't. It had simply stopped obeying. And standing there watching the people who actually had authority take control, I realized the truth she never did. The moment she chose power over safety, the ending became inevitable. The street felt different the moment the fire engine cleared the gate. Not quieter, exactly lighter. Like everyone had been holding their breath without realizing it, and only now noticed their lungs working again. Neighbors drifted closer to the entrance, not crowding, just standing together, looking at the broken metal on the ground, and then at each other. A woman wiped her eyes and laughed once, embarrassed, saying she hadn't realized how tense she'd been every morning until it stopped. A man in scrubs thanked the captain on his way past, voice still tight. People who'd barely spoken in months started talking short sentences, half smiles, shared disbelief. No one mentioned fines or rules or procedures. They talked about errands they could finally run without timing the gate, about caregivers who wouldn't have to argue with a clipboard anymore. Margaret stayed off to the side, silent now, surrounded by officials who didn't acknowledge her authority at all. Watching that, I felt the shift settle in my chest. The fear hadn't vanished instantly, but it had lost its grip. For the first time since this started, the street felt like ours again. The consequences arrived without drama, delivered calmly and out loud, so there would be no confusion. A city official read from a tablet, while another handed over printed, notices the paper crisped the language precise. The gate was formally condemned. Emergency access restrictions were prohibited effective immediately. Multiple violations were cited: unauthorized modification of emergency infrastructure, obstruction of first responders, and operating a controlled access point without required permits. Fines were assessed in the low six figures, with additional penalties pending review. A separate notice named individual liability for the person who ordered the changes, and when that line was read, several heads turned at once. The HOA's authority over access was suspended on the spot, replaced by city oversight, until compliance could be verified by a third party. An officer confirmed that all enforcement actions tied to the gate citations, access suspensions were frozen and subject to reversal. No speeches followed, no arguing, just signatures, timestamps, and clear instructions. Margaret didn't interrupt. She stood there listening as decisions were made about the system she'd built now, dismantled by process. And when the official finished, he looked up and said one last thing evenly: "This area remains open." The words landed like a seal. No one reopened the gate that night. Temporary barriers went up instead, bright, unmistakable, impossible to misuse. A patrol car stayed parked nearby, engine off, presence enough. Cars flowed in and out without pause for the first time in weeks. Deliveries arrived. Caregivers passed through without explaining themselves. The street relearned a simple rhythm it had forgotten. Margaret didn't speak again. She stood apart, phone pressed to her ear, nodding to someone who wasn't there. When a board member approached her, she waved him off. The clipboard hung useless at her side now, no boxes left that mattered. Officials finished taping notices to the control housing and moved on already, treating the entrance like any other piece of public safety infrastructure. As people drifted home, someone quietly removed the zip-tied HOA sign from the fence and set it against the curb. No ceremony, no announcement. It just didn't belong anymore. I lingered by the entrance a moment longer, watching headlights pass through the open space where iron had stood. The gate had been the symbol of control, but it turned out the real power was always simpler access that didn't ask permission when safety was on the line. I drove home without stopping, without waiting, without checking a light that no longer mattered. And behind me, the entrance stayed open because from that moment on, it had to. The HOA learned too late that when you lock people in, the first thing that breaks isn't the gate, it's your authority.